This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and this episode is brought to you by Silna Health. That's S-I-L-N-A, the premium front-end RCM company that leverages technology with a team of onshore insurance experts to handle benefit checks, eligibility checks, and prior authorizations. Finally, a vendor that you can trust, like a full-time employee that scales with your business. Just mention the Profiles in Leadership podcast to receive a free trial. Today, our guest is Rebecca Shaddix, who is a seasoned marketing executive and a go-to marketing strategist with a proven track record of driving significant revenue growth across various industries. With a unique background that combines deep technical expertise, data-driven marketing, and empathetic leadership, Rebecca has led high-growth companies in education, healthcare, and SaaS to impressive success. Did I say that right? SaaS,
You did, yep.
S-A-A-S? Okay, great.
Software as a service. Perfect.
Okay. Her approach is rooted in a research background, allowing her to blend analytical thinking with creative marketing strategies. As a Forbes contributor and recognized thought leader, Rebecca brings insights into the societal impacts of technology, particularly in areas such as AI's role in solving global issues and fostering diversity in tech. Her ability to align technology-driven solutions with broader missions while driving substantial business results sets her apart in the marketing and leadership landscape. So, Rebecca, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
So, give us a little context. I think you grew up in the LA area, and so tell us a little bit about, your growing up there and where you went to school and how you ended up where you are today.
You're right. I grew up in LA and then did undergrad and business school at UCLA. So I spent quite a bit of time in LA. Most of my life was there. And then it was just COVID that brought us out of it. My husband and I always said we would move to the Pacific Northwest when we retired. And then when we could work remotely, we came up here. But I was drawn to tech. I actually initially thought I would go into education policy for the promise of having impact at scale. And that's the exact same thing that drew me to tech. Impact at scale. And I love the autonomy that we have in tech. We can have an idea and there's really nothing stopping us from implementing it, which is such a fun thrill as a marketer.
Yeah, awesome. So tell me a little bit. I know that you're the founder and CEO of Strategic Partners. So tell me what that is, but then you also work with Garner Health. So explain what you're doing in those two
Sure.
areas.
I founded the go-to-market strategy firm Strategic Partners from a recognition that there's lots of really great entrepreneurial ideas that for some reason just didn't have that leverage to grow. And I found that go-to-market strategy and those effective go-to-market segmentation decisions, targeting, messaging decisions up front really had compounding impact on growth. And so that's where I started consulting sort of by accident while I was still in-house at GoGuardian and just found that the same skills that led that to become a really fast-growing education startup in a space that had been previously saturated by established competitors, those were the same skills that could apply to a lot of different industries. And that mission-driven tech drive has led me then to Garner Health, which is helping patients understand who the best doctors in their area are, and because it actually costs less to be treated by them because they make more accurate diagnoses and their patients have better outcomes. We pass the savings back on to patients. So that's just the promise of I love working with lots of different startups, and the ones that have really gravitated towards those mission, I've gone in-house a couple times.
Okay, how big a company is Garner Health? For those who are not familiar with the company, what's it look like? What's its size?
About 300 employees, Series D, 300 employees, backed
Uh,
by some investing firms you've definitely heard of, Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins, et cetera.
Okay, great. And a big part of what you do too is, geez, we hear about it every single day. The interviews that I've done lately have all included it as well, and that's AI. So
Mhm.
how is AI working for you in your role at Garner Health?
I'd say it's a really great research tool directly for me as a product marketer, as a researcher. It's a good thought partner to pull in a lot of different data sources quickly and then iterate. I think of it as sort of a junior level employee. I can give it very specific inputs. Here is our brand positioning. Here are inputs of our decks of campaigns that resonate. Learn about this audience. Here's a very specific question. I want to understand these different inputs, et cetera. And so it's been a tremendous tool of unlocking a lot of different speed around research, helping me identify places to go double click in deeper, and then evaluating our own data as well. The built-in AI platforms within the marketing automation tools we use have been fantastic. So I think we are just scratching the surface of what AI is capable of and the types of augmentation it's capable of giving us marketers.
So it sounds like it's made your job a little easier in a sense, or at least you can cover more ground. Does it complicate things? Does it make things harder to deal with, or do you think it makes it easier?
It's an interesting question. I think that it lets humans do what we strategically do better, more. The floor is pretty low for using AI at this point. The ceiling is pretty high. And so the competitive landscape changing, making sure that our human-driven messaging and campaigns are really resonating. It's been a great tool. It definitely lets me spend more mental energy on things that I'm uniquely good at, and it can do a lot of the time-intensive manual tasks that I'm not uniquely good at. It does make things more complicated in terms of just trying to stay on top of what is possible.
And when we look at AI, it's just this huge data um, regurgitator, so to speak, or whatever, of just all this information, whatever. But it's not a decision maker, right? I mean,
That's for
how do you look at it in that sense? Uh, you're not going to find answers in it. You're just going to find information. Explain that a little bit more.
For sure. Your outputs are only as good as your inputs. And if we're trusting tools that we don't totally understand the inputs to, double checking the outputs, making sure that they're validated with our own qualitative understanding of the market, that's how I think of it as not a decision maker. But I also don't think that turning to technology to make decisions ineffectively is new to AI. I think that lots of people for a long time have looked at a dashboard and said, this is what the data say, this is a decision. And that's just never been the case. And so the risk of making unfounded decisions is pretty high. We can feel confident that something that seems smart has spat out an answer. It's almost never that simple. It really does need to be validated with our own understanding because the same inputs are going to yield mediocre or unreliable outputs. We can ask very specific questions for very specific tasks and amplify that process. We should be building AI into all of our tools that can benefit from some of that processing ability, but it's not a decision maker. I would never just ask a question to AI and let it make the decision. I usually like to ask it to explain the decisions it's made to via an email to an executive, me, and understand the sources that it cited to get ideas of where to jump off of.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've said this a million times on this podcast that I'm definitely a right brain thinking leader. So, when I think of all the analytics and all the data and all that, of course, that's very important to decision making and looking at it. But that by itself is not something that you go to. You just want
Yeah,
to look at it in a very different way.
we do. We want to look at it as a tool that will
Yeah,
make our decision making as one input more confident. I think it was Jeff
yeah.
Bezos. It could have been someone else who said if the data and anecdotes disagree, the data are wrong. If you understand your customer base deeply and there's something off with the data, that's something to look into, not to pivot.
So in what we just discussed there about decision making by a tool, so to speak, is not realistic. Do you think people have unrealistic expectations of AI at this point?
An interesting question. I think that there is no way to predict what AI is going to be capable of currently, that there's no one who has enough expertise to say that AI can never or will definitely do something by a certain point. What I'm seeing now is just a lack of understanding of how to leverage AI currently. So there's the one side of unrealistic expectations that if you just ask a banal question, write me a marketing strategy. Well, no, that'll be a terrible output. And sure, you'd be disillusioned by it. But I also think that the fact that it's just growing in capability so quickly and accelerating so fast means that we can't predict what it'll be capable of very soon. So in terms of right now, I think that the expectations that you can offload strategic decisions to AI is unfounded. You're not going to get great strategy from AI at this point for any number of reasons. The AI's ability, the thinking of the people who would expect that. But in terms of what it can do 10 years from now, we have no idea. 5 years ago, I had no concept. I said I sold AI products since 2015, but the difference now is just compounding unrecognizably. So what AI will be able to do is hard to predict. We certainly can't offload decision making to it now, probably not ever.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. So now you received an award, the Los Angeles Business Journal's Rising Star of 2019. So that sounds like quite an accolade. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was definitely an honor. I was nominated by a former coworker for that after I'd started Strategica Partners and was very honored to receive it. It was a great event and recognition of helping startups grow with go-to-market strategy. So I appreciated it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So now you're talking to a person who probably has never really understood marketing at a level that I should, even though I was CEO of a fairly large company. So, how has marketing changed in the last 5 years compared to what you used to do and what you do now?
Good question. Honestly, I think more of the foundational getting back to human psychology of what never changes is the more interesting part of marketing now. So there's lots of things that have changed. The tools have expanded rapidly, the analytics at our fingertips, et cetera. But ultimately, getting back to the basics of understanding your audience and speaking to them like a human, that's permeating marketing throughout generations. And that's what I'm excited to see come back into the forefront for marketers. It's easy to get distracted by these flashy, shiny new channels or new outlets. Yeah, we can go on TikTok, we can implement this AI tool. That's great if that's where your audience is and you're able to speak to them. But the real point is figuring out who you're speaking to, and it can't be everyone, what they care about, and offering something of unique value to them. That's the core of marketing that I don't imagine will ever change. And that's what I'm interested and excited to have seen just become back to the forefront, that the psychology of marketing is really taking a whole new level of focus due in large part to your point that a lot of the skills that used to be differentiators, graphic design, any number of tactical hard skills, are increasingly being able to be commoditized by tools like analytics or design software, et cetera. And so what's defining great marketers is really more of the strategic understanding of the audience, which has been fun to see.
You know, it's interesting. I've been around a long time. I can remember when even marketing in healthcare was a bit of a, people would
Mm.
raise their eyebrows like, really? You're going to market healthcare? But now it's just commonplace. And in social media, and you said TikTok or Instagram or any other type of social media type of things, advertising healthcare, has that been good for healthcare, or is it has it muddied the water so we don't know what the heck we're looking at now?
Uh, that is a big, complicated question that is probably largely in the eye of the beholder in a lot of ways. There's a lot that's broken in healthcare. I don't know if the biggest part of it is the marketing directly to consumers, which is funky to a lot of countries. What I think is interesting about the idea of marketing in general and the idea of patients as consumers versus uh, directly getting advice from their doctors is there's just a lot more information at everyone's fingertips now. And so there's misinformation and bad information and misleading information and information that only applies to certain subsets. So who you can trust is of increasing importance, and making sure that it's a qualified doctor who is up to date on the latest medical research is exactly the point of tools like Garner, to make sure that the doctors who are making the best treatment recommendations aligned to the best practice research. That's the point of a tool like Garner. But to your question about marketing being good or bad, I think it's interesting. I never wanted to get into marketing. When I was first offered a job in marketing, my initial reaction is marketing. No, I'm not a liar. I don't need to sell people things they don't want. And so that idea of marketing as advertising, of selling people things they don't need or they don't want, was my outsider's view of what marketing is. But I've come to appreciate that really good products don't get into the hands of the people who can benefit from them just because they exist. That's the role of marketing, figuring out who can benefit from them. And then the ethics or the misapplication of lots of principles. Bad actors can go to war with a map, or they can deliver humanitarian aid with a map. Bad marketers can peddle opioids with a map, or they can deliver really life-saving new inventions to people who need them. So I think that the role of marketers is to be ethical in what we're offering to the people who can benefit from it. And that's what I'm excited to see, really, like I mentioned, be the forefront of marketing's evolution, is really coming back to the ethics and the basics of it's not just about turning short-term profit, really who is going to benefit from the better product. That's the role of marketing.
Well, if information is king, marketing certainly has helped educate the population, and again, if we look specifically at healthcare, I can remember again in the days when, people would come in after their internet searches and, ask all these crazy questions, which would frustrate, healthcare providers somewhat. But in a sense, now they come in more educated and more aware of what's going on, which, is a good thing. You can get to the chase quicker, or and find out what you can do to help that person. So, and as opposed to looking at it as a um, like challenging authority or something like that. It's more like, well, I don't have to start at step one here with this person. They already have some understanding of their condition and what some of the treatments are. So now we can maybe move faster to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, I love that take. And I think to your point, doctors have dozens of patients they'll see in a day. A patient lives with their conditions or their symptoms all the time. So they're motivated to understand more. The connection, I have fibromyalgia, and the connection between gluten and fibromyalgia was not well understood when I was first diagnosed. My mom figured it out through lots and lots of research for her teenage daughter, what was wrong. But at the time, all of the doctors we saw insisted that there was no connection between gluten and fibromyalgia, that if I claimed that there was, it was a sign of the placebo effect or that I was making this up for attention. And so medical research takes time to document and get large enough controlled studies to become best practice. Patients are motivated to figure out what's wrong with them and what can help them. And so there's ways of over-indexing on both sides of that. We certainly don't want the WebMD self-diagnoses to rule all of the conversations. But I think there is something to listening to the lived experiences of patients who are uniquely motivated to go seek out peer-reviewed papers themselves, in my case, and bring them to their doctors and say, hey, is this something that could be relevant to me? And so I agree with this new dispersal of information. It's a good partnership to have.
Yeah, that's great. So tell us a little bit. In doing some research for this interview, I ran across the UCLA Luskin Center of Innovation launched Women in Tech Initiative, and you were kind of part of that. So tell us a little bit about what that is and what you aim to do with that.
Steve, I love your research. This is great. You're going back to 2014, 2015. I love it. Yes, I led the Women in Tech initiative at the public policy think tank at UCLA under my maiden name, actually. So I'm very impressed that you found that, which was great. And that's another example of data helping inform a perspective. So when I was hired to lead the Women in Tech initiative by this brilliant, pioneering professor who has his PhDs and appointments in the engineering, law, public policy, and I also think business school. So he taught really fantastic courses and has PhDs and law degrees in all of those. But the fact that we were stagnating on diversity in tech was something that he was interested in and saw within his own students, and he launched this initiative, which was fantastic. But at the time I was hired, I actually thought that my job was to figure out how to get more women interested in tech, the idea of bias or systemic issues being what keeps women out of this pipeline to tech hadn't even crossed my mind. And so, to your point, your question of tell you about it, essentially, diversity in tech numerically sort of seemed to have peaked in the early 90s. And there's all kinds of questions about why that is, but we do lose women at every stage of that pipeline, traditionally, of education to then early career, mid management, and then executive management careers. And looking into why was the function of that initiative, which was really interesting. And conversion, this is a complex issue, and there's a lot of data we don't understand or we don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you're a Forbes contributor, so by that meaning that you write articles and things for that organization. And some of your publication topics, are wide-ranging and very interesting. I mean, I'll just name a few here: youth internet safety, human trafficking, women and diversity in technology, K-12 teacher tenure systems, impacts of merit-based K-12 teacher pay. Um, Very interesting and wide-ranging topics. So, how does one like you write about one of those things that maybe isn't in your core business that you're doing right now?
It's a good question. So, being passionately curious about interesting things has been my defining career path, which to me all feels very logical. I was curious. This was an opportunity to apply certain skills that I had. And so it went from education technology and education policy into consulting, into HR software, into healthcare, all leveraging different aspects of some core skill or interest. Those really just come about through passionate research of being really, really curious about something, seeing some connection between technology or data or distribution of new tech, and being curious about how it impacts certain people, including youth, including women, including other underrepresented groups, and just being really, really passionately curious about what it means and then dedicating a bit of time to research.
And on that education side, I don't know if you saw just in the last week or two that Daniel Pink published an article, I think it was in the New York Times, and basically said that we need to get rid of grades in school.
That's interesting.
That is just, like he's a researcher too. And so he gave
Mm.
a bunch of statistics, like I think it's like 80 to 85% of the grades given at Harvard are A's, and at Yale it's even higher.
Hmm.
And so basically his point is that it's not really performance based. It's more like, well, these people are paying a boatload of money to go to these schools, and you got to keep them happy. So you got to, happy people get A's, and it's just
Hmm.
an interesting thing that if we go back to, look in business, you don't sit down and have your leader come up and say, well, I'm going to give you a B on this, or I'm going to give you an A on this. It's basically, uh, feedback on your performance and looking at performance levels and things like that. And I just think it's really interesting. I know that's a sidebar, but I just found that
That's
interesting. So
interesting. I
yeah,
hadn't seen that article. Yeah,
yeah.
I do think it's interesting. The higher ed versus elementary and secondary education pipeline, probably a whole can of worms that we could spend many hours on. Uh, yeah, I mean, in terms of finding a way for admissions to evaluate who's performing, there have been schools who have experimented with not having grades, and it doesn't necessarily tend to yield consistently better outcomes. We think it'll yield more intrinsic motivation. That's not necessarily true. Extrinsic motivation gets a bad rap, but I mean, providing for your family is extrinsic motivation. And so I think there's a whole complex different threads we could pull on that. I don't know. I think that when we're talking about the education of millions or billions of diverse people at different phases of their life with different goals, it's hard to say if there's a single best system. Brown did try not having an Ivy League school, not having grades. It harmed their students' job placement afterwards, the goal of education, the role of education, students as consumers of a luxury good, of an expensive higher education versus students as students, lots of things we could pull there. But I think it's interesting, and I think that a lot of it comes down to the goal and role of education. Tests and grades do motivate students to learn in the lower grades, so I don't know if doing away with them altogether will yield the
Yeah.
results that we're looking for, but there is definitely benefit to things like project-based learning that mirror more real-world skills.
Yeah, he said that in his opinion that what students do is they're motivated to get the grade, not to learn. So I thought that was an interesting, in other words, their
Sure.
motivation isn't to learn more and more about this. It's just what do I have to do to get the grade? It's interesting too, and I've said this in my field as well. I'm a physical therapist. I was in the healthcare world. Um, And so much of education and then getting to where we need to be is very task oriented. You check the box. You got to do this. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to do this. And you check these boxes. And even in the learning on how to treat patients, it's very task and kind of, analytically oriented and whatever. And then you get out into the what I, will call the real world. And now you're expected to be a leadership and think more holistically and whatever. And a lot of people have a tough time making that jump. So I think that's another aspect of it where, you know, how we're trained to do what we're asked to do later. And I just go back to leadership. We can make the argument that leadership encompasses every single career, every single job ever, but it might be the least trained or taught thing in college down. And then people just really try and do it once we're in our careers.
Yeah, and the complexity of the research for what you would teach and distribute is tough because we do want a way of measuring that our teachers, our lawyers, our nurses have some prerequisite set of skills. We need a way of discerning what that is. But the syllabus effect, to your point, I think is real. And I felt that too of being in school, it was clear, here's the syllabus, this is what I need to do. In your junior career, hey boss, what do I need to do? I'll do it. Only goes so far. And so
Yeah,
that transition is tough in all industries, I think.
yeah, I agree. Another accolade that you can hang your hat on is you were identified as one of the top 100 marketing influencers
Mm.
in the nation. Again, pretty impressive. So how does someone get recognition like that? Is that just something that someone comes across and says, "Hey, you're this," or is it something that you kind of strive towards? I guess is what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
I don't know how that list was created by the Product Marketing Alliance, but was very honored to be recognized for sure. It's a great organization. I do post a little bit on LinkedIn. I'm not sure exactly how that list was curated, but was very grateful
Yeah,
for it.
yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
awesome. So you're on the board of directors of Girl Develop It.
Mhm.
Tell us what that is and what drives you to work with that organization.
Yeah, this is an organization I've been involved with since about 2018 and came across them through my Women in Tech research. We help women and non-binary adults transition into technical careers through a supportive community. And so that means the technical classes, coding, design, et cetera, but also career development and mentorship. And it's a great inclusive community. Before the pandemic, we had a very chapter-based model. So chapters all over the country and all over the world where people could come learn to code and work on their projects and get hands-on skill development training. And we moved to a virtual model out of necessity in the pandemic and actually found that it worked better for most people. It let them forge connections with people across the world. It also was a lot more inclusive for people who had trouble with transportation or childcare needs, et cetera. And so we've kept this virtual model since. We have a mentorathon today, for example, of we do things like hackathons and mentorathons, but basically it's a way for people to develop the technical skills they need to transition into tech and also the community, the confidence, things like resume, side projects, et cetera. That's the focus of the organization.
And is it for young girls or is it for
Adults. Yeah, it's a
adults?
confusing name. I see it's kind of like you go girl, but yeah,
Yeah,
for adults.
it's for adults. Okay,
Yeah,
okay, yeah, that's awesome. So let's jump back to some more AI stuff since
great.
it's on everybody's mind. When you talk about AI, it's kind of like you said it earlier, where it's information in. You got to have good information in, but then you also have to be asking the right questions of AI. So I'm just interested, as someone who works in this area a lot, how do you know what questions to ask? Or do you just experiment? You try this, you try that. It's kind of a trial by error, or how do you know what questions to ask?
All of the above. I think prompt engineering is its own field of expertise that we can get into, but really being mindful of the inputs that you're asking it to consider, giving, if I assume you mean a LLM like ChatGPT, for example, not the AI built into tools. So if we're saying to use something like ChatGPT, being intentional. What is your role? What is your audience? What are the inputs you should consider? What's the outcome we expect? These are all very basic parts of the question to ask. even something like improve this email doesn't give it a lot to go off of. This draft of an email is going to this audience. I want them to have this takeaway. Rewrite this to ensure it's clear, etc., is still better than improve. And so just being mindful of the intent that you're giving AI and what you're asking it to do is the first step in my mind.
Yeah. And when you since we're talking about, this podcast about leadership and cultures and companies and things like that, do you see a way? I mean, how could AI help a leader build a great culture in a company? Do you see any parallels there? Do you see how you could use that tool in that sense?
Sure, I see the role of AI in things like performance management software, helping managers overcome things like recency bias. If you use a tool like 15.5 to do check-ins and collect feedback throughout a quarter, then when a manager goes to sit down and evaluate the performance holistically of their team, they'll have more inputs than just trying to remember how things went. So if you're tracking your goals and your progress within a tool, you're identifying trends in goal completion. Those are inputs that are obviously very easy to game. It's easy for me to put in 7 easy goals I know I'll win. So I see it as identifying trends and picking out data across large data sets that could be interesting to evaluate, again, as a tool, not as a decision maker. And so I don't think of it as shaping culture so much as it's possible to do anything with any number of intentions and have very different outcomes. But I see the benefits of having more centralized information sources, having less confirmation or recency bias about how someone's performing, given the data of how their goal attainment has been, et cetera, their feedback from other teams. I see that as having tremendous potential for AI to identify trends upstream of what's causing disengagement, et cetera.
And just on a practical basis, I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh my gosh, the time that AI, Chat GPT has saved me." Like, hey, I want to, come up with this job description, or I want to come up with a proposal or something, and I just, you know, say a few things into it, and I get this thing. It's like, wow, that's pretty impressive. That just saved me 2 hours of what I would have had to create, on my own, just thinking it up, and then I can just go in and edit it a little bit. So, do you see AI as a time saver for leaders?
I see AI as a time saver if they're intentional about the inputs they're putting into it. So there's any number, for example, of job description inputs for a product marketing manager. If we're looking for one that's oriented on sales enablement or go-to-market strategy or messaging and positioning, I definitely see tremendous time saving in writing from a series of bullets and then distilling key takeaways from longer sources of information. So I definitely see the time saving capacity. Where I'd want to make sure things don't save time up front but cause issues down the line is the copy and paste of a marketing manager job description for another company may not be what your team needs. It may be exactly what your team needs. But if you're intentional that we want these skills to be the focus, then certainly creating something you can publish can be accelerated with AI.
So let's talk about disc golf. I mean, seriously, are you a disc golfer, or did you just use that analogy? I heard you say that a good miss is sometimes
Yeah.
worth doing.
I was a pretty avid disc golfer for a while, and then I ruptured my extensor tendon and can't release quite as quickly anymore, so I haven't gone quite as much. But yeah, I love disc golf.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. And in that, I saw something that you said that relating to disc golf is that like sometimes you try something and you miss. It's kind of like learning from a failure, so to speak. So that's a good miss as opposed to a bad miss that is just uh, a crash and burn situation.
Sure, and I think know your miss might be the quote that I really like from disc golf, that advice. It tends to be an average. If you average to overshoot or undershoot or go to the left or the right, it'll feel odd to aim farther left than you think you should, but that could be the miss that you need.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So what excites you? What are you passionate about right now when you're looking at your career and what you're doing and all this AI stuff and whatever? What gets you up in the morning, get you pumped?
Yeah. I'm writing a book, which is a very
Nice.
answer that question. I mean, I'm excited about this renewed focus on what never changes about humans. The book that I'm working on is about how to spend these little micro pockets of time, 90 seconds to 20 minutes, that are between the structured blocks of our day more productively, more effectively, so they're aligned with our values. So that's been fun. I enjoy that.
So is that all just, is that research oriented, or are you just trying to get down what's in your head on paper?
Both. I'd say it definitely stemmed from years of research of what makes people happy, what leads to a good life. And the outcome of that tends to be more productivity, more success, but really just we all feel starved for time, right? That never feels like there's enough time in the day to do everything we want. And it's about how we can reclaim more of those lost moments to feel like we have more agency over spending more time on the things we enjoy.
So do you think that, we hear a lot in the workplace about burnout and people are just exhausted and there's just so much to do and whatever. So are these ideas that you're presenting that help deal with that part of frustration?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of that feeling of always being behind, of being overwhelmed, is kind of juxtaposed to the fact that we have more leisure time and a shorter work week on average than we did 50 years ago. But we feel inundated and bombarded by this pressure to constantly be on. So even if we're not working as many hours productively, we're still answering emails at 8:30 on a Saturday, feeling like we have to be constantly plugged in and present. And that doesn't necessarily yield better outcomes. And so for things like a 4-minute break between Zoom meetings, what's a way to scientifically re-energize that'll make you more productive, more fulfilled, and feel like you have more energy in your day? And there's lots of ways to do that. The question is aligning to your values, and then the book gives a bunch of recommendations for how to do that.
And I'm sure everybody has their take on it, and I heard somebody just in the last couple of weeks make the analogy that one of the reasons they think people are so exhausted these days, or so they say they're exhausted, and they said it has more to do with loneliness.
Mm.
That that we're not as relational as we were in our businesses in the past. You don't hang out as much, and you don't talk about whatever. It's with the hybrid work situations and things like that. That this person thinks that loneliness is a piece of that. Have you thought about that, or have you discovered that? Do you think that's legit?
Yeah, social connection is one of the biggest predictors of wellness and well-being. And absolutely, this feeling of connection. So, one of the things that I like to do is just use these little blocks to write notes to friends, handwritten notes. And I just keep them stationary right on my desk. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes, and it's a fun way to feel connected back into their day. And so, definitely, the feeling that seeing posts is a replacement for in-person, face-to-face dinners is tough.
Yeah. So are you on a timeline? When's this book going to be done?
TBD. It is not even drafted yet, let alone with a
Okay.
publication date. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm always interested with authors because I kind of look at writing a book as like let's just say daunting. So are
Mhm.
you somebody who schedules time to sit down and write, and that's what you do, or do you write when you get inspired, or do you make notes all day along the way and then come back and what's your writing process? I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
I have set writing times and then make notes throughout the day that I converge sometimes in those writing times. So I'm constantly reading, getting new ideas, putting those in a centralized note that I then use to convert in those writing blocks.
Yeah. Is it pleasurable or is it
Yeah.
arduous?
I'd say it's mostly fun at this point. It has been years of consolidating notes and research in the making, and that could change. But for at this stage, it's mostly fun with maybe 30% arduous.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. Well, what else is on the horizon for you? What other things are you looking forward to besides finishing this book?
That's the big one. I am curious how leadership mentality shifts in business culture, how we get more data-backed evidence of what works to motivate people to get more productivity that's aligned with results and growth. So I'm definitely curious to see how workplace culture and leadership philosophies evolve in the next decade or so.
So, it's interesting. I thought the pandemic really brought up some interesting, things. For instance, you know, with everyone working from home for a time. some people loved it, some people hated it. It's
Mhm.
pretty, we can tell what personalities loved it and which personalities probably hated it, if you look at personality types. But and then kind of the hybrid thing has come back, and now some of the companies are saying, no, we need you in the office 5 days a week. So, in your experience, what do you think? Is there a place for, just working from home all the time? Is hybrid the way we're headed? Should we all come back to work? Do you have an opinion about that?
I think there's ways to do anything well or poorly. If there's reason to have, and the data will show in the next decade or so how companies grow, where productivity lies. It's hard now with so many confounding factors. I don't have a hard and fast opinion on any one model of anything being better for all companies forever. I think there's ways to do return to office mandates that are counterproductive and don't yield more productivity. I think there are downsides and difficulties in managing fully remote teams that are possible not to account for and to then not have benefits from. So I think it really does come down to the implementation, how culturally people decide to apply certain things, why, how it's explained, the autonomy that managers have to shape the best outcomes for their teams, and then staying relentlessly results oriented. Do you see higher retention, any number of outcomes, productivity, goal attainment through certain types of models, and why? Are there learnings of that management style that should be adapted? I don't think there's any one hard and fast approach that would work for everyone. And I think there's ways to do all of them well or poorly.
Yeah, and I think sometimes our perceptions or our predictions, don't come true. I can remember when it first started, everyone saying, "Oh my gosh, people aren't going to work, and they're just going to laze around and put in a few hours, and then say they worked 8 hours and whatever." But the actual data showed that people were actually almost more productive when they worked from home than when they were in the office. So, that was a kind of a
Many people were, absolutely.
yeah, universal thought that, oh, this is going to be horrible. And it actually, people actually maybe created more stress in their lives by being more productive and working harder and putting in longer hours.
Sure, and it's that output versus input control. It's easy to see if somebody is on time at their desk. But if they're yielding mediocre output for 12 hours a day, that's not really what the company is trying to optimize for. So the attention to the results and the outcomes is exactly what I think is going to be the focus.
When you anticipated our discussion today, what haven't I asked you that you want to be sure and get in the program? I was the first to admit I'm not an expert in marketing by any means and marketing leadership. So what should we talk about that we haven't yet?
Yeah, I think that marketing leadership, engineering leadership, there are technical implementations that are different, but leadership is leadership, motivating people to do their best work, giving enough clarity that they understand what good looks like, setting enough process in place that things are productive, but not so much that it's constrained. These are all kind of universal across any number of industries. And when I said I'm excited to see what doesn't change, what we focus on, that I mean it. I think there's more similarities in good management in any department. There's more similarities in how people thrive and do their best work. All of that is implementation specific and less focus on controlling and measuring and being punitive about the outputs and more focus on how we can structure the best outcomes and outputs that motivate people to do exceptional work. That's what I'm excited to see shape up in the next decade.
It's interesting when, again, since I was in this leadership role as a CEO, sometimes people get hung up on like, well, this is the way that I do it, or this works for me, and they
Mhm.
can produce a certain outcome. And that's done in a very different way, maybe a less traditional way than we've seen it in the past. And some people say, well, wait a minute. I mean, if they just would do this or do that, then when they would even be more productive or produce a bigger outcome. So I think when you focus on the process of how to do things, that isn't always as effective as like you said, the outcome, because the way that I produce the same outcome you do may be totally different, but it could
Mhm.
be just as effective. And I think as leaders, we have to be willing to let people get there in a way that is different than maybe what's traditional or maybe the way that we would approach it.
Totally agree. That control is yielding mediocre output. I want to make sure that I can de-risk what my employers are doing is not going to yield exceptional innovation. So this I do it this way, you must do it this way, is playing not to lose. And it's not going to retain the best people or inspire them to innovate or help people reach their potential. It just makes people take fewer big, bold swings and just do things that they think will be agreeable or good enough. So I agree. And then to your point, managers saying, well, I do it this way, so it's the right way. It's an interesting tension of the people in power. Managers may say it's easier for me to manage in person. You have to come back in person. The ones who have figured out, can I hire the best team dispersed in different ways, find different benefits. And so I think it really is the question of this regression to the mean, playing not to lose, tends to be rewarded as companies grow. And how do you maintain that drive for output as opposed to controlling those inputs?
And I think it's also the fear of treating people differently. Like,
Mm.
again, if you focus on the outcome, and you let people do it their way, there's fear that, well, wait a minute, I made you do this and this because of your style. By let somebody else do it their way, then it looks like, oh, I'm giving them favoritism, or I'm not holding them as accountable as I am you, and things like that. So I think that sometimes we fear that. I've always felt you can't treat everybody exactly the same way because different personalities react in different ways. But yet, the fear, HR fears or whatever that you're treating people differently, I think drive that sometimes.
Yeah, and it's playing not to lose. You're optimizing for a place of fear, right? And this idea that managers have to hold people accountable for the inputs is exactly what you just talked about. If they're
Yeah.
accountable for hitting their quota, okay, maybe they go on the road, maybe you make calls from your desk. They're still accountable for the outcomes. It's this accountability and control of the inputs, thinking that it'll yield the same output. That's exactly the crux of the problem. I don't understand this, oh, I have to hold you so accountable. If you're here at 9:02, you're getting written up. That's not the point of how people who take agency thrive. And everyone needs to feel agency over their work to feel motivated. So this is just why a lot of people get jaded and just start doing mediocre work, I think, rather than saying, you're responsible for the outcomes. Let's shape them and do it effectively.
Yeah, I mean, just take an extreme example. Let's say that you had projected a certain outcome that you want two people working independently to produce an outcome. And they both produce the outcome and they both do exactly what you wanted to, and you celebrate that. But one person did it in an hour and another person did it in 10 hours. Should they be um, uh, looked at the same? Should they be paid the same? Should, all those things come in because somebody was able to do it much quicker and in a very different way. And like I said, that's where it gets muddy, I think.
It's a pretty common cognitive bias, but it's a question of what you're paying for. Are you
Yeah.
paying a person to sit at their desk for a certain amount of time? They can do that. Are you paying for outcomes? You can do that. But
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be muddy. If it's about the outcomes, sure, if someone takes 5 weeks of PTO this month or this quarter and they hit the same goals, should that be rewarded because they figured out a way to do things more innovatively? That's the culture question.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, Rebecca, at this time in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question, and that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Hmm. We already hit on know your miss in relation to leadership. Define your values because they shouldn't be the same necessarily as anyone else's, and they may not be the same as yours 5 years ago. Define your values, make decisions through them so you don't have to relitigate every new decision. If you know your values are these three things, for me, it's don't sit on the bench. So if sit on the bench is this metaphor, if your skills aren't being used, you're capable, but you're not in the game, then either go to a different court, start your own league, but don't stay in a role where you're sitting on the bench. Make decisions from a place of empowerment, not fear, and take up space. So those are all easy ways for me to say, is this a way to live those values? And I don't have to relitigate how should I approach this decision. All these decisions are filtered through that lens. So define your values. They should be unique to you. Revisit them and then make all of your decisions through them because you'll never regret a decision made through your values. I think of this even in investing. We make decisions, my husband and I, of investing through our values. we were fully prepared to lose a whole bunch of money doing something that was aligned to our values, but didn't seem like a good economic decision. And then it was. But even if we had lost a bunch of money or the stock that we sold had gone up, we would have felt good about that decision. Same thing with hiring decisions, same thing with company choice decisions. Make decisions through a lens of your values and revisit them. And then also, I like to ask myself routinely, if I could give my 20-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be? Because I find that it anchors those values in my growth in a way that makes me realize how far I've come. We tend to keep focus on what we have to achieve, etc. But I like to look back and say, if I could give my 20-year-old self one piece of advice, it would be there is no rush. I felt like I had to figure out exactly what I wanted to do and get great at it very quickly. And recognizing that makes me appreciate how far I've come and also that re-anchor into my current values. So just that reflection of your values and making decisions through them, I think is a really great way to take a lot of stress off the day to day.
Yeah, well, that's very well said, and I think the point that you were making there too is, I think that is a common mistake. I've heard it before. Enjoy the journey, and understand there is a process. It takes time. I mean, somebody at the that's my vintage definitely knows that it didn't happen all at once. It took time. You did it over a period of time, and that's hard to see at the front end of that,
Mhm.
but you certainly can appreciate it at the back end. So for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, this has been a real pleasure. I think you have lot to share, and I learned a lot today. I hope you enjoyed our time here, and you got a lot going on. So congratulations on what you're doing, and welcome to the Pacific Northwest. We're glad to have you.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. It's
Yeah.
great to be here on the show and in the PNW.
Okay. Well, take care and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, you too. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.